They called me a charity case at my own brother's engagement party, not behind my back, right there at the table, in front of his future in-laws, with the good china out and the candles lit, and everyone dressed like they were trying to impress someone. My mother said it with a smile. That's the part I keep coming back to, not the words themselves, but the smile she wore while she said them. Easy, practiced, like she'd been saving that particular phrase for exactly the right audience. I was 31 years old. I had a full-time job. I paid my own rent in a city where rent is not a joke. And I sat there with a fork in my hand and a glass of Chardonnay I hadn't touched, and I smiled back at her. I didn't say a word. What people don't understand, what I couldn't have explained to you back then, is that silence isn't always weakness. Sometimes it's a decision. Sometimes you stay quiet because you're already 3 moves ahead, and making noise right now would only slow you down. I had been keeping a record for almost 8 months by that point. They didn't know that. Nobody at that table knew that. Growing up, I was the one who didn't fit the mold. My older brother graduated from business school and went straight into finance. My mother introduced him at parties like he was a trophy she'd won. My younger sister married a man who owned a small chain of car dealerships in the suburbs, which somehow in my family's math translated into her being successful by proximity. And then there was me. I became an elementary school teacher. 4th grade. I taught 9-year-olds how to do long division and write their first persuasive essays and understand why it matters that you read things carefully before you sign them. I loved my job. I was good at my job. I had kids who came back years later to tell me I was the reason they didn't give up on school. None of that mattered at Sunday dinners. My mother had a way of working my job into conversations like it was a gentle tragedy. She's a teacher, bless her heart, or the one I heard most often. She's still figuring out what she wants. I was 28 when she first said that. 28, with a full classroom and a mortgage I was managing on my own, and a life I had built from nothing, and apparently I was still figuring things out. My brother's name was Preston. Preston had never once figured out how to do his own laundry. Our mother did it until he left for college, and his wife did it after. But Preston was a success story. Preston had vision. Preston understood the value of money. What Preston understood about money was that other people's money was easier to spend than his own. But I didn't know the full shape of that yet. I was just beginning to see the edges of it. The engagement party was at my parents' house. My mother had been planning it for 3 months. She called me 4 times in the 2 weeks before to ask me to help with the food. Not my sister, me. My sister and her husband were guests. They would arrive at 6:30 with a bottle of wine and sit down and be served. I was asked to come at 2 in the afternoon to help set up and spend the next 4 hours in the kitchen, so that by the time the important people arrived, everything would be perfect. I said yes. I don't know why I kept saying yes. I think, for a long time, I believed that if I showed up enough times and worked hard enough and never complained, something would eventually shift. That they would look at me one day and actually see me. Not the version of me they'd decided I was back when I was 22 and turned down a corporate job offer to take a position at a titleized school, but the actual me. The one standing right in front of them. That shift never came, but I kept showing up anyway. The party was going smoothly, the way things go smoothly when someone's been working since 2 in the afternoon to make sure they do. Preston's future in-laws arrived. Her parents were from Connecticut, very put together, the kind of couple who had matching luggage and opinions about wine regions. They were perfectly nice people. They sat at the table and asked everyone polite questions about their lives. When they got to me, I said I was a 4th grade teacher. Her mother smiled. Her father nodded. And then my mother said, from across the table, in the same casual tone she used to ask someone to pass the bread, "We always say she has a heart of gold. Teaching is such a generous profession, especially when it means living on a teacher's salary." Then she laughed softly and added, "We try to help her out when we can. She's our little project." Her little project. I was 31 years old. I put my fork down. I picked it back up. I took a sip of the wine I hadn't touched in 40 minutes, and I smiled. Preston didn't say anything. He was cutting his steak. My sister caught my eye for just a second and then looked away. And that small look, The one that said, "I see it. I'm sorry, but I'm not going to say anything." That one hurt almost as much as my mother's words. Her mother, to her credit, said, "Oh, teachers do such important work." And the conversation moved on, the way conversations do when everyone decides, collectively, that moving on is easier than staying in the difficult place. I helped clear the plates after dinner. I washed the good crystal by hand because my mother doesn't trust it in the dishwasher. I drove home at 10:30 at night and sat in my car in my apartment parking lot for a long time before I went inside. That was the night I stopped waiting for the shift to come on its own. I need to go back a little to explain the thing I mentioned, the record I'd been keeping. It started about 8 months before the engagement party, the night my mother called to tell me that my grandmother's house had sold. My grandmother had passed away the previous spring. She'd left behind a small house in rural Pennsylvania that had been in the family for decades. In her will, a will I had never seen, a will that was handled entirely by my brother because he had power of attorney. The proceeds from the house were supposed to be divided equally among her 3 grandchildren, me, Preston, and my sister. I knew this because my grandmother had told me. She told me directly, sitting in her kitchen over coffee the summer before she got sick. "I've made sure it's equal," she said. "I want you all to have a fair start." She had looked at me in particular when she said it, the way she sometimes did, like she knew something about the world that she wanted to make sure I knew too. The house sold for $230,000. Divided equally, each of us should have received roughly $76,000. My sister received her share. Preston distributed the funds. I received $31,000 and a letter from my mother explaining that Preston had had to advance a portion of my share to cover some family expenses, and that the remaining amount had been redirected to offset some costs, and that I should be grateful because things had been complicated and Preston had worked very hard to manage everything. I read that letter 3 times. Then I set it on my kitchen table and looked at it for a while. $45,000 was missing, and the letter did not say where it went. I want to be clear, I did not immediately go into crisis mode. I did not call my mother screaming. I did not show up at Preston's door. What I did was go to my desk, take out a fresh notebook, and start writing everything down. Every phone call, every comment, every family event where something fell off. Dates, times, what was said, who was present. I had always been a thorough person. Years of writing detailed lesson plans and parent communication logs will do that to you. Documentation is just a habit, once you learn it. I also called a lawyer, not to start anything yet, just to understand my options. What she told me was to keep documenting, to get copies of everything I could legally access, to not tip anyone off until I was ready. So I didn't. I kept showing up to Sunday dinners. I kept answering my mother's calls. I kept helping with parties. And I kept writing things down. 3 weeks after the engagement party, Preston called to ask if I wanted to invest in his new business. He was launching a real estate investment group with 2 colleagues. The pitch was polished. He'd clearly given it several times already. The opportunity was time-sensitive. The minimum buy-in was $25,000. He expected returns within 18 months. Family got a preferential rate. I asked him to send me the paperwork. He seemed surprised I asked for paperwork. He said it was more of an informal arrangement, that it was based on trust among people who knew each other. I said I understood, but I'd feel more comfortable seeing the terms in writing. He sent me a 2-page document that had no registered business entity listed, no attorney signatures, and a clause on page 2 that described the investment as non-refundable in the event of market uncertainty. I thanked him and said I needed some time to think about it. That was a lie. I had already thought about it, but I needed time to forward the document to my lawyer and to the state financial regulatory office, which I had already been in contact with after discovering that 2 of Preston's previous investors, friends of my parents, people I'd known my whole life, had quietly lost significant amounts of money in a similar arrangement 3 years before and had never been repaid. Preston had not told our parents about those prior investors. He had, however, borrowed $45,000 from my grandmother's estate, my share of it, to fund his lifestyle in the year after that first arrangement collapsed. My lawyer confirmed what I had suspected. What he was doing wasn't quite illegal in a clean, easy-to-prosecute way, but it was far enough over the line that the regulatory office was very interested in the documentation I had been compiling. I submitted everything in January. My mother called me in February to say that Preston was under investigation. She called me, specifically. I don't know if she thought I would be surprised, or sympathetic, or that I would know something she could use to help him. I wasn't sure what she wanted. Her voice was tight in the way it gets when she's trying to sound calm and not quite succeeding. I listened. I said I was sorry she was going through a stressful time. I asked if there was anything she needed. She said, "Did you know anything about this?" I said, "I filed a report with the regulatory office in January, yes." The silence on the other end of the line was very long. Then she said, "Why would you do that to your own brother?" And I thought about the engagement party. I thought about the $230,000 house and the letter with no explanation. I thought about every Sunday dinner where I was the punchline, and every time I showed up at 2 in the afternoon to cook while my sister arrived at 6:30 with a wine bottle and a smile. I thought about 8 months of a notebook filled with careful, dated entries. I said I did it because it was the right thing to do, and because I had $45,000 worth of reasons that belonged to me and were taken without my knowledge or consent. She hung up. The investigation took several months. I won't walk through every detail because some of it is still settled and some of it is private. What I can tell you is this. The regulatory office found sufficient grounds to pursue action. 2 of the prior investors who had lost money were brought back into the process. Preston's business filings were audited, and my $45,000, or rather the amount that could be recovered from the estate records, was ordered to be returned to me. It wasn't the full amount, it was $38,000, but it was documented, it was ordered, and it was mine. My sister called me once during all of this. She said she understood why I had done what I did, but that it was hard on the family, and she hoped I knew that. I told her I appreciated her calling. I meant it, actually. She was trying in her way. My mother did not call again for a long time. When she finally did, she did not apologize. She said she thought we should try to move forward. I told her I was open to that, as long as moving forward meant something different than what the previous 31 years had looked like. She said she didn't know what I meant. I said I know. There's something I've thought about a lot since all of this happened. About why I kept showing up, why I kept saying yes, why it took 8 months of documentation and a lawyer and a regulatory filing for me to stop quietly absorbing things that were never okay. I think I believed, for a very long time, that being easy to overlook was a price I had to pay, that if I were patient enough and quiet enough and helpful enough, eventually the people who were supposed to love me would decide I was worth seeing clearly. What I know now is that no amount of casseroles or clear plates or silent dinners was ever going to change how they looked at me. Because the way they looked at me had nothing to do with what I did. It had to do with what I represented to them, the decision they couldn't take credit for, the life that didn't fit their story, the daughter who chose something they couldn't brag about at parties. I was a 4th grade teacher. I am still a 4th grade teacher. Last spring, one of my former students, a kid I had in my classroom 8 years ago, a quiet boy who used to sit in the back row and stare out the window. He sent me a letter. He's in college now. He said I was the first adult who ever told him that the thing he loved, the thing he was actually good at, was worth pursuing. He didn't know how much I needed to read that letter when I did. My salary is not impressive by the standards of certain dinner tables. My apartment is small. I don't have a business to pitch or a brand to manage or a spouse with a dealership. What I have is a classroom full of kids who are learning that paying attention matters, that being careful matters, that the quiet work you do when no one is watching is sometimes the most important work of all. I keep a notebook on my desk, still, old habit. And I smile when I need to, and I document everything, and I know exactly when to stay quiet and when to stop being the only one at the table who hasn't said a word. I still have that first notebook. It's in the bottom drawer of my desk, underneath a stack of old lesson plan binders. I don't look at it often, but I keep it there. Not out of bitterness. I want to be clear about that. I keep it because it reminds me of something I had to learn the hard way, that paying attention is not the same thing as being suspicious, and that writing things down is not the same thing as holding a grudge. It's just being honest about what happened. For a long time, I thought patience was enough. I thought if I showed up, kept quiet, kept helping, kept being easy, eventually the people who were supposed to love me would choose to see me clearly. What I didn't understand then is that the way people treat you is rarely about what you deserve. It's about what they decided you are. And no amount of casseroles or cleared plates or silent Sunday dinners was ever going to change a decision that was made before I walked in the door. That's the part that took me the longest to sit with. Not the $45,000, not the investigation, not even my mother hanging up the phone. It was the realization that I had spent years trying to earn something that was never being withheld for a reason I could fix. What changed things? And I mean really changed them. Not just the legal outcome, but the way I moved through my own life, was the decision to do the right thing even when it cost me. Reporting what Preston had done was not comfortable. It didn't feel triumphant. It felt like swallowing something cold and just holding it down. But it was honest and it was correct. And the part of me that spent 8 years teaching 9-year-olds that honesty matters knew I couldn't look them in the face if I let it go. There's a kind of integrity that nobody claps for. It's not dramatic. It doesn't announce itself. It's just the quiet decision to tell the truth even when staying silent would be easier. To act on what you know is right even when the people around you are pretending they don't see what you see. I had to develop that slowly, over years, mostly alone at a kitchen table with a notebook and a lot of uncomfortable clarity about what was actually happening in my family. And then there's the discipline of it, the actual work of paying attention, keeping records, not acting until you understand what you're looking at. That's not a talent, that's a habit. I learned it from teaching, from writing parent emails and tracking student progress and understanding that nothing you can't document actually exists in the world of formal consequences. I applied the same rigor to my own life, and it was the most useful thing I've ever done. My grandmother told me she wanted things to be equal. I think about her saying that sometimes. She understood something that the rest of them didn't or chose not to, that the quiet ones are watching, that the ones who get overlooked at the table are often the ones who understand most clearly what's happening at the table. She saw me, and when everything else fell away, what I had left was exactly what she would have wanted me to have: my own clear conscience, my own 2 feet, and the record of every single thing that happened. That's enough. That has always been enough.